Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The sun was still climbing when Delia Boone's voice echoed off the clapboard walls of the general store in the town of Silvergrove, loud and clear as a bell in a canyon. "I do not care if your flour shipment is late, Mr. Keller," she said, hands on her hips, cheeks flushed with heat and fury. "It is your job to fix it." A few townsfolk winced. Some laughed under their breath. But by the time Delia turned to leave, storekeeper Keller's face was the color of a boiled beet. Delia pushed through the batwing doors, skirts swishing, hair wild with the wind. She stomped down the street, not caring one bit that heads turned or whispers followed. She had been in Silvergrove for only 5 months, and already half the town had made up their mind about her. Too loud, too bold, too much. By sundown, they made it official. The landlady of the boarding house stood on the porch with Delia's trunk beside her. "You're not welcome here no more," she said flatly. "I run a quiet place." Delia stared at her, then at the dusty road behind. She had no family here, no friends, just a job sweeping out the post office and a voice too big for the town to hold. She was about to lift her trunk when a voice behind her said, "I can take that." She turned. A tall cowboy with a weathered felt hat and a tanned face stood there, his eyes steady, his mouth pulled in a quiet line. The sun caught the gold in his brown hair. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30. Dust clung to his boots and the cuffs of his shirt, but his hands were clean, gentle. Delia blinked. "Why?" The man crouched to grab her trunk. "Because you look like you need a place." "And I got one. I do not even know your name." He set the trunk in the back of his wagon. "Isael Carter, my ranch is just outside town, and you want to bring me there?" "I would rather not see you sleeping in the dirt," he said simply. Delia hesitated. She had been raised to be careful. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no trick in them, just a quiet steadiness that called to something deep inside her. "All right," she said. The ride out was slow over hard, packed earth, the wagon creaking as they passed open plains and stands of cottonwood. Isael did not talk much. And for once, Delia did not feel the need to fill the silence. She watched him handle the reins with quiet confidence, the way he checked the horses with a soft cluck and a twitch of the line. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned orange at the edges. A small house stood near the edge of a hill, with a barn off to the side and chickens pecking near a fence. Isael hopped down and offered her a hand. "Place is simple, but it's clean." Inside, it was just as he said. A single room with a bed tucked in one corner, a stove in another, and a narrow table by the window. He gestured toward the bed. "You can take that. I will stay in the barn." Delia turned to him. "You do not have to, I do," he said quietly. "It is the right thing." She nodded, throat tight. "Thank you." He paused at the door. "Folks say you are loud," he said, voice low. "But it sounds like music to me." Delia blinked. No man had ever said that before. Not her father, not the pastor, not the man who left her in Missouri with nothing but debts and a broken promise. She looked at Isael, really looked. His eyes were tired but kind. There was something in him that felt solid, safe. "Good night, Isael," she said, softer than she meant to. He tipped his hat. "Good night, Delia." The next morning, Delia rose early to the smell of coffee. Isael had already been to the barn and back. He handed her a mug and a slice of bread with honey. "There is work if you want it," he said. "Chickens need feeding, fence needs mending." "I can do more than sweep floors," she said. He smiled. "I know." They fell into a rhythm. Delia patched shirts, hauled water, learned to milk the goat that wandered too close to the porch. Isael worked the cattle, came back each night smelling of sun and leather. They ate together, mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable kind. Easy. Sometimes she would hum while she cooked, and he would sit at the table and close his eyes like it soothed something in him. One night, after the rain had passed and the frogs began to sing, she stepped out onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Isael was already there, leaning on the railing. "You do not talk much," she said. He glanced at her. "Talk is not always needed." "No," she agreed, "but sometimes it helps." He looked out at the dark hills. "I lost my folks young. My uncle raised me, but he was not the warm kind. I got used to quiet." She stepped closer. "I got used to being told to be less, talk less, feel less." Isael turned to her. "You should not be less." There was a long silence. Then she said, "People say I am too much. They are wrong." She looked up at him. Why did you really take me in? He met her eyes. Because you did not deserve to be put out like that, and because I liked the sound of your voice. Delia's breath caught. You really meant that? I did. She took a step closer. The air between them shifted, warmer now. I like the way you listen, she said. He reached out slowly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered, calloused but gentle. I like everything about you, Delia Boone, her heart thudded. Even my loud mouth, he smiled. Especially that. She laughed, and before she could say anything else, he leaned in. Their first kiss was slow, steady, nothing hurried. He cupped her face like she was something precious. She kissed him back with her whole heart. When they pulled apart, she stayed close. You sure about this? She whispered. I have never been more sure of anything. She leaned her head against his chest and let herself breathe in the scent of him, earth, smoke, and safety. Delia Boone had been called too much her whole life. But in Isael Carter's arms, she finally felt just right. 2 weeks after the first night, Isael gave her a place to sleep. Delia stood alone by the windmill, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands raw from the fence post she'd been setting with a borrowed hammer. The wind moved through the grass, steady and low, like a breath drawn slow. She didn't look over her shoulder when Isael rode back in from the upper pasture. She just drove the last spike into the post and wiped the sweat from her brow with the inside of her wrist. You're using the wide end, Isael said as he dismounted, tying off his horse. That's why your palms are burning. I'll make gloves next time, she said, standing straight. Didn't want to ask for yours. He stepped closer. You could have. Delia glanced down at her hands. I don't like owing people. You don't, he said, steady as ever. Not for anything. She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. He took the hammer from her gently, hung it on the hook by the shed, then came back to stand beside her. I passed the McElroy's wagon near the creek, he said. Their boy's sick. They're asking around for help. Delia's gaze lifted. What kind of sick? Fever, stomach. They said he hasn't kept anything down in 2 days. She hesitated, then nodded once. I know a poultice that might help. If someone can get me white willow bark and some clean muslin, I have both. A pause stretched between them, but not an empty one. She looked up at him, something unreadable passing across her face. You trust me that much, Isael met her eyes. You've lived harder than most. And you didn't break. That's enough proof for me. That night, she sat in the corner of the kitchen with a basin of cool water and a handful of dried herbs, grinding them with a stone Isael had carved from a river rock. She worked by the low light of a lantern, her brow furrowed, hands moving with the kind of focus that comes from having no one else to depend on but yourself. Isael leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her. She didn't notice until she reached for the cloth and found it folded neatly beside her. You always stand that still, she asked, not looking up. Sometimes. His voice was quiet. Only when I'm trying not to disturb something important. She pressed the poultice into a satchel and tied it off. I learned this from a freedwoman I traveled with for a time. She had a way of making everything grow even when the soil was wrong. What happened to her? She went east, said she wanted to see the ocean before she died. Delia smiled faintly. I hope she made it. Isael took the satchel from her hand without asking. His fingers brushed hers, rough and warm. I'll ride it to the McElroys now. It's nearly midnight. They're still up. You can tell by the lamp in their window. She let her hand fall. Be careful. He met her eyes. I always am. After he'd gone, she stepped outside to watch the dark. The stars were sharp overhead, clean and bright, like they'd been nailed into the sky by someone who meant for them to stay. She wrapped her arms around herself and listened to the quiet, feeling the space he left behind. 3 days later, Isael returned from town with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and handed it to her without ceremony. Inside were needles, fresh thread, and 2 yards of calico patterned with tiny blue flowers. She looked up, startled. You bought me fabric. You said you'd make gloves. She traced the edge of the cloth. Most men wouldn't notice something like that. I notice more than you think. Delia folded the cloth gently, smoothing it with her fingers. Thank you, he nodded once. The McElroy's boy is up and walking. His mother said to tell you she cried when she saw him hold down broth. Delia swallowed hard. That's good. Isael reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. They sent this, said it's the only sweet they had left. She opened the tins slowly. Preserved cherries in syrup. She stared at them a moment, then looked back at him. "You want one?" she asked. He shook his head. "They were given to you." She took one out, sticky and dark, and held it toward him. "I'm offering." He hesitated, then took it between his fingers and ate it slowly, like he wasn't sure what to make of the taste. "Too sweet?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just right," she laughed, sudden and soft. "You always say the right thing." "No," he said, eyes steady. "Only when I mean it." Later that night, as she sat sewing by the hearth, Isael came in from the barn with his coat dusted in hay. He didn't speak, just took his place on the stool beside her and watched the fire. After a long while, Delia spoke without looking up. "What did you want before all this?" He turned toward her. Before me. Before this place took up all your days." He was quiet a long moment, then he said, "I wanted something that didn't vanish when I reached for it." She looked at him then, needle paused in mid-stitch. "And now I want you to stop pretending like you're only passing through." Delia set the fabric down slowly. "I don't know how to stay, I never learned." "I can teach you," he said, "but only if you want to learn." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she rested her hand on his knee, fingers light. He covered it with his own, holding her there. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. Inside, the hearth crackled low. Neither of them moved to break the silence. They didn't need to. Delia stood by the creek with her skirts tucked up, washing the last of the muslin strips against a flat stone. The water was cold enough to bite through the heat of the afternoon, the sun high and hazy through the cottonwoods. A pair of cranes passed overhead, wings slow and wide, their shadows gliding across the water. Behind her, Isael was mending the ox yoke near the wagon shed, sleeves rolled, a sliver of leather pressed between his teeth. He worked without rush, his focus quiet, hands sure. Days had settled into a rhythm between them, tasks taken without asking, silences that stretched without strain. But something unspoken had been gathering, low and steady, like a summer storm that hadn't broken yet. When she returned to the house, Delia laid the cloths over a chair near the stove. Isael leaned in the doorway, watching her. "There's a trader passing through from Laramie," he said. "Wants to barter for preserves and eggs." She wiped her hands. "You think we've got enough to spare if you take what we don't use, yes?" He offered dry yeast and 2 sacks of rye flour. She tilted her head. "You trust him," he nodded. "I've seen him 3 springs now, keeps his word." She didn't answer right away. "Then I could ride out with you tomorrow." Isael's brow lifted. "You want to?" Delia picked up the empty pail. "I'd like to see who else is out in this world, even if it's just a man with a wagon." He stepped aside to let her pass. "Saddle's yours if you want it." The next morning, she rode beside him on the buckskin mare he'd broken last fall. The trail wound through open pasture and into hills dotted with sage. They rode in easy silence, the kind that had come to feel like understanding. When they reached the trader's camp, Isael introduced her without explanation, and the man tipped his hat with a nod. "You his wife?" the trader asked bluntly, lifting the lid off a tin of dried beans. "No," Delia said, taking a step closer, "but I'm not nobody either." Isael didn't speak, just glanced toward her with something unreadable in his eyes. The trader huffed a laugh and moved on to slicing samples of cheese. Later, as they rode back with the flour lashed across the mule's back, Isael broke the quiet. "You didn't have to answer him." Delia kept her gaze ahead. "I did." He was quiet a long while. "Then, what would you have said if he'd asked me?" She pulled the mare to a slower pace, letting the wind move through the grass around them. "I would have waited to see." Isael drew his horse alongside hers. "Seen what, if you'd say yes?" He looked at her then, long and steady, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "I would have." The horses picked their way around a low patch of mud. Delia didn't speak again until the barn roof came into view. "I've never had a man wait for me to be sure," she said quietly. Isael reached across the saddle and brushed his fingers over hers just once. "I can wait." That evening, she sat on the porch steps with a bundle of linen in her lap, piecing together a new apron. Isael brought out 2 mugs of chicory brew, handed her one, and sat beside her without a word. After a few sips, he said, "I'm thinking of planting winter wheat this year." She looked at him sideways. "That's a hard crop." "I know," he said. "But worth it if the soil holds." Delia folded her fabric. You always choose things that take time. He met her eyes. Some things are worth waiting for. She set the linen aside. If I stayed, what would we be? Isael didn't look away. Whatever you want, so long as it's together. A breeze stirred the dust along the path. The last light of day caught in her hair, and he watched her like there was no one else in the world. Delia reached for his hand, folding her fingers over his. I think I want to build something that doesn't move when the wind rises. He turned his palm to meet hers. Then we'll plant deep. That night, she didn't sleep in the house alone. They lay side by side beneath the quilt she'd sewn last month, their hands still clasped between them, not for heat, but because it felt like the beginning of something that would hold. The calf had come breech. Isael's voice was quiet but urgent as he leaned through the open door where Delia stood, wiping her hands after folding linens. I need you at the barn. She didn't ask what for. She followed. The air outside was sharp with the promise of early frost, though the sun was still warm on the tops of the cottonwoods. In the barn's half-light, a dun-colored heifer stood trembling, her sides heaving. Straw clung to her damp flanks. Isael knelt beside her, sleeves rolled, arms already slick with blood and effort. She's been laboring too long, he said. I can't reach the legs proper. Delia nodded once, pulling her hair back with a strip of cloth as she knelt beside him. She didn't flinch when he handed her the iron hook, didn't pause when her hands sank into warmth and muscle. She moved by feel, steady and sure, until her fingers found what he couldn't. Right foreleg, she said, voice low. It's turned back. Can you set it right? I can try. Isael pressed a hand to the heifer's neck, murmuring something low. Delia worked without looking up, sweat standing on her brow. When the calf finally slid free, slick and still, she caught it with both arms. Isael took it gently, clearing its nose with a strip of linen before rubbing its chest with straw. The calf gave a weak bleat. The heifer turned, nosed it once, then twice, and began to lick. Delia sat back on her heels, hands trembling. Isael leaned against the stall wall beside her, breathing hard. You done that before? He asked. Once, in Kansas. She wiped her palms on her skirt. That one didn't make it. This one did. She looked at the calf, then at him. She would have died without help. Isael nodded. Most things do, left alone too long. They sat in the quiet for a while, the only sound the calf's wet snuffles and the creak of the barn beams. Isael reached for the canteen, handed it to her without speaking. She drank, then passed it back. I've been thinking, she said, brushing hay from her knee. We could dig a root cellar before the frost. There's a dip near the south fence, stays shaded most of the day. Isael took a slow drink. You planning to stay through winter? She turned toward him. I'm not planning to leave. He didn't smile, just leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in. Then it's yours as much as mine. That night, she lit one of the beeswax candles she'd poured the week before. The soft golden glow reached the corners of the house and turned the plain walls gentle. Isael washed his hands at the basin, sleeves damp, and came to stand behind her as she laid out the last of the dried herbs along the windowsill. You ever miss Missouri? He asked, voice low at her shoulder. Only what I thought it might be, she said. The real thing was colder than the wind here. He rested a hand at her waist. You could have gone east, found a job in a bigger town. I've already had enough people tell me to be smaller, she said. I'm not looking to disappear. You never will, he said. Not with me. She turned then, slowly, and looked at him fully. I want to marry you. Isael didn't flinch, didn't look away. I was waiting for you to say it. She stepped into him, cheek to his chest, and listened to the steady beat of his heart. I don't want a preacher with a book, just your word. You have it, he said. Every part of it. They stood like that until the candle guttered low. Then they made up the bed together, folding the quilt down smooth, and lay side by side with no distance left between them. In the morning, she rose early and tied her hair back with a strip of the same calico she'd once meant for gloves. Outside, frost clung to the grass in silver lace. Isael was already in the barn feeding the calf, his breath clouding in the cold. Delia stepped into the light and called out, her voice clear and bright across the yard. He looked up. That's still music to me, he said, and she smiled wide, unashamed because she knew now it always would be. The day of the wedding came quiet and dry, the sky pale with the edge of winter. Isael hitched the wagon just after sunrise, brushing a thumb across the wooden rail where Delia had tied a strand of prairie grass in a loose knot the night before. She stepped out wearing the dress she'd sewn from leftover bleached muslin, the hem trimmed with a strip of blue calico. Her hair was caught up in a braid coiled low at her neck, pinned with a sprig of dried sagebrush she'd tucked there herself. They didn't speak on the ride into town. Words didn't feel needed. Isael kept one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on her knee. The road stretched ahead, quiet and gold with fallen cottonwood leaves, the air sharp with the smell of distant wood smoke. The justice of the peace met them in the back room of the feed store, where he kept a Bible and a chair sturdy enough to stand on when he needed to reach the ledger shelf. No one else was there. Delia had insisted on it. "Just say it clear," she told the man. "And let us answer honest." Isael kept his gaze steady on her the whole time. When he said, "I will," his voice didn't waver. When she answered back, she didn't blink. The justice offered a paper to sign, but Isael shook his head once and slid a small silver pin across the table instead. "This was my mother's, passed down. I'd rather give her something that's lasted." Delia took it in both hands. It was shaped like a swallow in flight, the edges worn smooth. She didn't say thank you. She just fastened it at her collar and held his gaze. They rode back with the sun climbing above them, the horses slow, unhurried. When they reached the ranch, Isael lifted her down by the waist and kissed her in the open yard, where the chickens scurried and the fence still leaned where it hadn't yet been mended. That night, she cooked a stew with wild onion and the last of the dried venison. He brought in a bundle of wood and fed the stove until the house held steady warmth. They didn't talk about the ceremony. They didn't need to. Later, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, boots off, eyes tired but peaceful. She crossed the room barefoot, the floor cold under her soles, and laid her hands on his shoulders. "You ever think about children?" she asked. Isael looked up at her. "I do." She sat beside him. "I never thought I'd want them, but I think I might now." He took her hand and kissed the back of it. "Then let's build a life that could hold that." In the weeks that followed, the land changed. Frost came harder. The mornings breathed mist across the hills. Delia dug the root cellar with Isael, her shoulders aching for days. They stacked potatoes, jars, and sacks of flour inside, and every time the wind howled, she felt steadied by its presence. She began writing letters to women she had once known, those who'd helped her, those who might need help now. Isael built a shelf for her paper and ink, and didn't ask questions when she stayed up late with her thoughts. One morning, as she stood outside watching the sky pale above the pasture, Isael came up behind her and wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "I heard from the McElroys," he said. "They want to trade for a pair of goats, but they can't spare much." "We've more than we need," Delia said. "Give them the pair with the strong teeth." He kissed the side of her neck. "You always say what I was already thinking." By December, the house had changed. The quilt was thicker, the pantry was full, and the bookshelf Isael had built held more than just tools and ledgers. Delia had started keeping a journal, though she didn't let him read it. Not yet. On the eve of the new year, they sat by the fire with their chairs pulled close and a mug of warmed cider between them. Isael rested his hand against her knee, and she leaned into his shoulder. "You ever think it could be like this?" she asked. "I hoped," he said. She watched the firelight flicker across the floorboards. "I used to think I'd have to fight for everything, that nothing would ever come easy." Isael tilted his head toward her. "This wasn't easy." "No," she said, smiling, "but it's steady," and it was. They spent that winter together, laying the bones for a life held in patience and shared labor. Come spring, they planted early, with Isael mending the old plow and Delia marking each row with a string line and a pencil. She built a cradle from pine scraps and painted it in the evenings, though she hadn't told him yet why. When she finally placed his hand on the soft curve at her belly, he didn't speak. He just rested his forehead against hers for a long, still moment. They named the baby Josephine, after the woman who'd taught Delia to brew dandelion tea and read the sky for storm signs. She was born one soft June morning, the same hour the first tomatoes ripened on the vine. Isael built her a swing before she could walk, tied between two cottonwoods down by the pasture. Delia taught her to name every bird that passed overhead. They raised her with the same quiet strength they'd built in each other. Years passed in the way seasons do. The barn was repaired and painted. The chickens grew old and slower. Isael's hair silvered at the temples. Delia's hands lost their sting but not their steadiness. They still rose before the sun, still ate side by side, still stepped into the silence like it was a language they both understood. And every evening, no matter the weather, they walked the edge of the field hand in hand, the house behind them glowing warm against the dusk. Because they had built something that held, because they had planted deep, because they had chosen each other again and again with every passing day.